Chris, first of all, I want to start by saying not only sorry, but thank you for taking your time. For those that are listening, that we're doing this during Shark Week completely by accident because we had some scheduling things. So I know your time is very precious, and I appreciate you taking the time for the conversation we're going to have today, especially on behalf of lifeguards and involvement with this subject that's super important. So,
absolutely. Lifeguards are a really important component of what we do. They're on the front lines, and they're always interested in sharks. So the more information we can get to them, the better.
Absolutely. Let's start off with just your story on what you do, the Shark Lab, and how you got involved with all this stuff.
So, the Shark Lab is actually one of the oldest shark research labs in the country. It was founded in 1966 by Dr. Don Nelson, who was kind of a pioneer in shark research. And in the early days, shark science was driven through the military, right? So the military was interested in how do we protect aviators and sailors from sharks, right? And during war times, a lot of people were injured by sharks. So, and in fact, it got so bad at the end of World War II that there was a serious morale problem in the military because of shark-related injuries. So the military was really interested in how do we protect people.
Where was this? Where was the military when they're doing training in the water and stuff, or where was these?
During wartime? So
okay.
You've heard of the USS Indianapolis, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean that was like the classic, shark bite example of how the military is at risk. You put aviators or sailors in the water, ship sinks. They're in the water. They could be in the water for a long time. And when those people are being bitten or even killed, or in some cases consumed by sharks because they're already dead, that creates a big morale problem. People are like, I don't want to get on a ship, right?
Yeah.
So the military really wanted to develop shark repellents. And the problem was there was nobody really studying sharks at the time. And they basically recruited a bunch of fish biologists and said, hey, can you help us develop shark repellents? And they're like, we don't really know much about sharks, but we're going to have to start with how they perceive their environment. So early days, it was all about how sharks smell, how they can hear, how good is their vision, because in order to develop a repellent to protect people, you really had to understand those things. So the first generation of shark scientists like Don Nelson, he was a behaviorist. He was interested in why sharks do what they do. And his early research was focused on how sharks hear. So he was the one that founded the Shark Lab. And in order to study shark behavior, he quickly learned, as a diver, because he was an amazing spear fisherman, won world records, right? So he was a great water guy, but realized studying sharks by being in the water with them is not feasible. So he started to develop new technology. So a lot of the technology we use today around the world, acoustic telemetry to spy on sharks, was developed in the Shark Lab back in the early 70s. So I took over in 1998. He passed away in 97, and I have been running the Shark Lab ever since. So its evolution has kind of developed greatly with technology, and a lot of things have changed even since the time I took over.
Absolutely. And what inspired you to first start the research just in your personal life to get to this point?
Well, I grew up on a small island, and there was nothing to do but swim, dive, fish. And I did lots and lots of that. And I love fishing. And one day I caught a shark, didn't know what it was. Had to go to the library, was not a good student. Librarian almost fell over. And I said, I need to figure out what this thing is. And she gave me a book on sharks. And that was it. That kind of got me started. And then after that, I got really interested in research because it was a puzzle that you had to solve. And I love that part. So I love the creative part of doing science and being in the water. So those were the two things I got to combine that just kept going and going and going.
Yeah, awesome. And bring us back to the present day, what is the focus? I know without hitting all the details of history, and I know you guys do a lot of stuff, even like stingray research and many facets. What is the primary focus now that the lab is doing currently?
So one of the things we noticed, we were working with Monterey Bay Aquarium, who was trying to keep a white shark on exhibit. And in order to do that, they needed to know something about what young white sharks do. So we know that Southern California is a nursery because that's where we find the smallest white sharks, in fact, right along beaches. and they asked us to help figure out, what kind of temperatures do baby white sharks like? What do they eat? Things like that. So we started tagging juvenile white sharks, and we were working with commercial fishermen that would accidentally catch them in their nets. We would tag sharks and then follow them around, see where they went. So that was kind of the beginning. And then what happened was, and this was about 2006, at first we had a hard time finding them. And then suddenly it got easier and easier, and sharks started showing up more and more at beaches. Before we were catching them offshore, but now they were right off public beaches. So we were like, well, we can't just go out and fish for white sharks off a public beach. This is a public beach. So we started working with the lifeguards who are going, there are white sharks off our beach? What do we do about this? And I said, well, we don't know. We don't even know why they're there or why they're attracted to these areas. So can we partner? So by working with lifeguards, anytime we would go out to do anything, they were right there with us. We were either on their PWCs, we were in their rescue boats, they were helping us with the diving because they didn't want some group of jokers out poking sharks at their beach where they're trying to keep the public safe. Mm-hmm. So by working with them, we could ensure safety, and they were getting data as soon as we were getting it. So I think that partnership evolved over time was really instrumental in putting us where we are today. So 2018, we received funding from the state because of this. We were working with all the ocean lifeguards in Southern California. So one of our local representatives said, how can I help? So we co-authored a bill. We got $3.75 million to develop the California Shark Beach Safety Program. And it was largely because we were partnering with the ocean lifeguards and helping them with this, what was perceived a public safety issue. So in the early days, we were tracking sharks and monitoring, giving those data to lifeguards. And then they would use that to decide, do we need to close a beach?
Cool. Wow. And I think that's a huge, small but hugely important fact that here you are relying on those, but you guys, both entities, lifeguards and the lab, are on the front lines of something new, a curiosity that's happening on behalf of the greater good of the public and the curiosity of how do we find out more about this. So that's really exciting.
And this, it's interesting because the stingray story started the same way. Mm-hmm. 25 years ago, I was a new professor here. I was taking my students out to Seal Beach, Ray Bay, to do beach science, to collect fish and identify them. And one of my students got stung. So lifeguards were right there. They were helping to treat the student who got stung by a stingray. I was well familiar. And I started talking with lifeguard. And then the chief shows up. So he's like, this has been a huge problem for this community. Like, we've been struggling with this for decades. We've tried culling stingrays. We've tried translocating them. What's going on? And I said, well, this is a cool opportunity for us. Let's do some research on stingrays. 20 years later, it's the best studied stingray species in the world because of that. And it all came back to the fact that people were being injured. So we have a new study coming out. We estimate at minimum 10,000 people are treated for round stingray injuries in Southern California alone. That's the most anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. So this location has been dealing with this problem for decades. And now that we're learning more about stingrays, we can teach people the stingray shuffle, things like that, and ways to minimize interaction. And more importantly, if you do get hurt, what do you do?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought the stingray thing up because I know sharks is a more sexy subject. However, stingrays is a very valid daily subject for lifeguards in Southern California. And people don't understand that in a single day, the lifeguards can potentially treat, let's say a couple weeks ago when I was riding along for the project, I think they had about 50 at Huntington, up to 150, I think, in a single day as far as the records go, maybe even more in certain places. But the important thing, like you said, 10,000 around injuries in Southern California. Well, imagine if those were 10,000 911 calls that burdened the local EMS system with this thing, which is actually treatable by lifeguards. But people don't see it that way, that we're kind of fending that portion off. But yeah, and then can you expand just a little bit on the Ray Bay situation in Seal Beach? Because I just found out about that recently as well.
Yeah, so it's the end of the San Gabriel River, and lining the San Gabriel River are power plants. And those power plants historically would draw seawater in to cool the plant and discharge warm water. And in addition, you got a break wall there that causes very fine sediment to build up right there at the edge of Ray Bay, which is a great longboard break. So you have warm water and you have soft sediment. That acts like an estuary, which is where these rays typically go and breed and feed during the summer. In Southern California, we filled in most of our estuaries. They're all gone. So we've created this fake estuary at a place like Ray Bay, and it just so happens to be Seal Beach. Very small beach jurisdiction, but the lifeguards were treating like record numbers of injuries there. They would have 100 injuries in a day. So we started looking at the stingray population there. So we would go down and do beach stains, and the lifeguards would help us. We'd use it to tow our net out with a PWC. Our biggest catch was 800 rays in a single net tow. And I had a grad student go out and do snorkel surveys out there, and he found that outside the wave break, there would be a band, like a 30-foot wide band, where there were so many rays you could not see sand.
Oh my God.
They were carpeting the bottom.
Oh my God.
So can you imagine you fall off your board?
I don't like that. You just said carpeting the bottom. I'm cringing in my
Exactly. So it was no wonder they were treating like 100 injuries a day, right?
Yeah.
And then, we started tagging. So we would tag the rays. We tagged 2,800 rays in 1 year, and we recaptured 11. So if you do some back of the envelope calculations, we estimated that there were 16,000 rays at this one stretch of the beach at any time in the fall. 16,000. So this became this project that we were working directly with the lifeguards, and we started to find that when the swell went down and it got really calm and it got hot, the rays would creep in closer to the beach, and they would see a spike in injuries, right? Because people would just be wading out to go out in the surf. So we actually now can predict when you're going to have more stingray injuries based on oceanographic conditions and our study of the behavior of the rays. So we can predict where they're going to show up based on water temperature, sediment type, whether the sand is really fine, and if the swell goes down, we tell lifeguards, post signs, do the stingray shuffle, watch out for rays. It is so predictable that we're going to start working with the local news companies and news networks in terms of their weather forecast. You know how they do a rip current advisory? Mm-hmm. They're going to start doing stingrays, saying, okay, it's going to be a stingray day, so make sure you do the shuffle. Swell's down, water's warm, so please be careful when you go out. 10-second spot during the weather. So remember, we educate a lot of locals. Locals know, right? But what about people coming to Southern California to visit? Mm-hmm. What's the only network broadcast that they watch when they're on vacation? They're going to watch the weather. So this is a great opportunity to educate not just locals, but people that are coming to Southern California to enjoy our beaches. And it's easy. It's a simple spot, and it gives them the information that can help keep them safe and reduce lifeguard workload, right? Because treating stingray injuries takes a lot of time.
A lot of time, yeah, and it's from what I've seen, and correct me if I'm wrong if you've got better information, but for that pain to go away from a stingray injury, anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours of soaking someone's foot in hot water. And if you've got 50 to 100 people doing that at the same beach, now the distraction is from the more critical thing, which is watching the water, preventing water rescues from happening, things from rip currents, et cetera. So that's huge, and that's super cool to know that because for us, it's a public information thing. Right. And if you're a lifeguard in Southern California, I can guarantee you answer that question multiple times a day on stingrays and sharks and all of that stuff. Guaranteed every single day, every single tower. So if we can get that out there in a more easier way, then maybe people can come with more intriguing questions like, where should I swim? Or can you clarify how the stingray shuffle looks, or something along those lines?
Exactly. So we've developed some great signage, infographics to educate the public. In fact, some of these will start going on the back of towers, lifeguard towers, right? Really simple art. It's great art. It's not written in 18 different languages, but it's easy art to understand. Mm-hmm. And we've got a great PSA that's on our website that just kind of talks about what stingrays are and why they're there, and they're not out to get you. But if you step on one, it's going to defend itself. And then how do you avoid that? And what do you do if you get stung? So these are tools that are free, and they're available to lifeguards. They link to them. They put them out in their social media. Anything that we can do to help those resources are available. And that's something that the California Shark Beach Safety Program enabled us to produce and provide for free.
Cool. And it's cool that all of this is coming from seemingly simple, like you were at the beach studying, the lifeguard said, hey, this is a problem, what can we do about this? And then you actually activated to create a change with that, and it fielded this whole study, right? And then similarly with working with the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and then, well, hey, we want to do this. Okay, well, let's start studying that so we can figure out how that works. And it seems like it turned into a broader option on research and now turning into public safety, which is super cool.
And that actually is really important because as a scientist, I'm the science geek, right? I get all wrapped up in, oh, these are cool things that we're learning about these animals. But it's so much better when you have an application. When people look at what you're doing and go, oh, that's valuable. That has application. We can use that. And whether it's helping to keep people safe at the beach and helping lifeguards with their job, or even informing the public so that they can make better decisions when they go to the beach in terms of risk assessment, or even what can I do to minimize my chances of getting hurt. So all those things are kind of cherry on top, right? For me, because I get to do cool science and learn about all the cool things these animals are doing. My students get to see how real life science can be applied, and they begin to see that you're doing science that it gets used. And that right there doesn't get any better than that.
Absolutely. And I can speak on behalf of the lifeguard side. We want to know more about the environment we're working in and learning about all this stuff. That's why we are at the beach, to learn about all the wonders that it has and why it brings all these people to the beaches, to get that, like you referred to, nerdy stuff, which I do think is cool. Let's focus back on sharks. Hot topic, buzzword. Give me a brief history of where the shark subject has come. And I think that a big portion of that probably comes down to the movie Jaws.
Yep.
And then how it's progressed to where you're researching now, and we'll get into Southern California, juveniles, population, the public, that kind of stuff. But give me a brief history of the shark's perception in your eyes from kind of start to modern day.
Yeah, and that's been something really interesting. Remember, I'm just a lowly biologist, right? So I'm interested in marine biology and what these animals do, and their involvement in their community. But at the end of the day, what I've been learning more about is human psychology, because when it comes to sharks, it's perception. So people's ability to make a risk assessment in terms of going in the ocean comes down to what they perceive a risk to be. And there's a big difference between perceived risk and realized risk, something I've learned from my psychology friends. Okay, so one of the things that we know is Jaws had a huge influence in terms of affecting people's perceptions of sharks. In the early days, in fact, what you saw in Jaws wasn't that far from the truth. Those books that the chief was going through and reading about sharks, that was kind of the extent of our knowledge of white sharks at the time. So it didn't have to deviate too far from the truth. But people, because of Shark Week and things like that, where they exploit sharks, that if you see a shark, it's going to bite you, it's going to launch out of the water, the gnashing teeth, mindless feeding machine, none of that has turned out to be true. So as we've learned more about them, that dialogue has completely changed. The problem is a lot of people's perceptions are still based on this concept of Jaws. So this is where our mission is to get science out to the public. And what we're finding based on people's perceptions is the more they understand about sharks, those perceived risks are starting to change. In other words, they're not looking at sharks as being this dangerous animal. And I'll give you a great example. 150 years ago, if we were to walk down to see San Pedro and you were to ask anybody, about whales, oh man, whales were horrible animals. They're demonic. They killed people. And in reality, they kind of did. Whalers would go out, they'd try to harpoon whales to bring them back, use the oil for light, things like that. And they would get killed because they're in small boats, right? And the whale's going to defend itself. They'd come back, they'd tell these stories about whales. And people on the shore never got to see a whale because they were all hunted out by that time. So the stories were bad. Whales were awful animals. Think of Moby Dick, right? Okay, so they got hunted to the verge of extinction. By the early 70s, suddenly biologists realized, we need to inform the public that these are fellow mammals. They have little eyelashes. They give live birth. They nurse their young. They're highly social. They have very big brains, and then people's perceptions of whales began to change. They got a PR makeover, right? So now people love whales, right? Oh my God, whales are so majestic. They're beautiful. So we went from fearing them to now revering them. Okay, so flash forward. Okay, here we are with sharks. Jaws came out in 1975. Perceptions are not good. Sharks got overhunted. They got overfished. Numbers are now coming back because better fisheries management, conservation. And what we're not seeing is that those attitudes change as fast as they did for whales. They are changing ever so slowly, but still there are a lot of people that go with that Jaws-based fear. So we're trying to pull pages from the old whale playbook and say, how do we change? How do we do a makeover for sharks? And it's happening. It's just happening really slowly. So now we're getting to the point where if people are in the water, surfers in the water, and they come out and they say, you know what, I just saw a white shark. Instead of panicking, they were like, that was freaking cool. A white shark swam right by me and I got to see that. And you know what? It didn't do anything. It just swam right by me. So I think one of the things that we're starting to see is that those perceived risks are now starting to change based on what people are seeing and learning about these animals. So therefore, the realized risk they're beginning to realize is crazy low.
Do you have some stats off the top of your head? Because I know it's very minimal, but regarding numbers or things to showcase to the public or to lifeguards, what is that realized risk of how many, let's say, injury versus fatal versus non-injury encounters? And if you don't have that exactly, that's all right, but roughly.
We do have some averages. And what's really interesting about this phenomenon is you got to remember what's happened over time is sharks get overfished, including white sharks. And it wasn't until probably mid-90s that they got protection. And then since that protection, we've seen numbers kind of go up, right? So that's a sign of population recovery. For other species, same thing. And there are a bunch of reasons as to why populations recovered, largely due to protection. The ocean is actually getting cleaner. Believe it or not, despite all you hear, we had some of the worst polluted water anywhere in the world off California in the 70s. Clean Water Act was huge in helping us clean that up. The other thing is we have to remember is that more people are using the ocean for recreation than ever before, and for a wider variety of activities. So we're adding more people to the water. Sharks are coming back. So you put those two together, you'd expect bites would go up. But believe it or not, bite rate actually in California, on average, we have 3 bites per year on average. 97% of those bites are attributed to white sharks. And that's because they're one of the largest predatory species in our waters. When you look at that per capita, it's actually gone down. So the per capita bite rate in California has decreased. And that gets a lot of people going, wait a minute, how's that possible? You put more sharks, more people, you would expect, just by random chance, that the probability of being bitten would go up. But it actually isn't. And that, for me as a biologist, tells me a lot about the motivation, why sharks bite people. Clearly, we are not food. We are definitely not food, because otherwise, it would be a buffet for sharks off these beaches, literally. Nobody would go in the water because bites would be happening every day. So we just don't see that. So it's just not true, simply not true. Now, accidents do occur. Okay, so let's say one reason why sharks bite people is for feeding reasons. Sharks in a feeding mode, and humans are similar size to what adult white sharks would feed on, seals, sea lions, things like that. And let's just say a white shark makes a mistake, confuses a surfer for a sea lion. Okay, but if you look at probabilities, think about how many surfers are out there. Think about how much time they're spending in the water. And there are white sharks along those beaches all the time. That if sharks made mistakes that often, we would see a lot more bites than we see. Mm-hmm. So the joke is, and I always bring this up to the public, hey, listen, even sharks make mistakes. But ironically, they make them a lot less than people do. And yet people are more worried about sharks than they are about other people, which is kind of a weird thing, right? The other challenge in coming up with statistics is that, and this is something really frustrating, I know it's frustrating for lifeguards, is we really don't know how many people are in the water. or how much time they're in the water and what activities they're doing. So a couple of years ago, we started a study where we were flying drones along beaches, and the goal was to actually quantify who was in the water, where were they in the water, how far were they from the shoreline, how far were they from the wave break, and how often did they interact with sharks. And this was actually a groundbreaking study. So one of my grad students, Patrick Rex, flew 1,700 drone missions across 26 beaches, all across Southern California for 2 years. And one of the things we found was there are places where these white sharks aggregate, these nursery hotspots. At those nursery hotspots, 97% of the days that he surveyed, he saw sharks within 60 feet of a person. Now, because surfers are outside the wave break, a majority of where the time white sharks are spending are outside the wave break, surfers had a greater probability of interacting with white sharks than, say, waders who are inside the wave break. Swimmers are often outside the wave break, but they are less abundant than surfers. So surfers were like 8-1 for surfers. Now, stand-up paddle
Was this year-round or during the summer specifically?
year-round.
Year-round.
Year-round. So every month he surveyed all these beaches. So those data are actually the first data, good data that we have for the number of people in the water. Now, it's not comprehensive, right? So we couldn't survey all beaches. We couldn't survey every day. But now the cool thing is, this is the cool geek. I'm going to geek out a little bit.
Please.
All right. So imagine this is like 1,800 hours of video that this guy had to go through and had to measure the distances from all these objects and identify those objects. So we started collaborating with engineers, and we said, okay, we need the software to identify surfers, swimmers, stand-up paddleboarders, waders, and then automatically measure those things. So to do that, I had an army of undergrads that had to go through and identify all those objects. Now, surfers are hard, right? Because a surfer can be laying on a board, sitting on a board, or standing on a board. And you had to be able to differentiate that from a bodyboarder. So it took thousands and thousands of images to train the software using AI. And now we can do that autonomously.
Cool.
We can pump a video through. So a lot of the cities are going, we want to know how many people are off our beaches. We can do that in minutes. So if they go out and fly these missions and they give us the video, we run it through that engine. It'll count. It'll count how many surfers are out there, how many swimmers, if they want to know where they are from the wave break. So this may be important for guards, right?
Hugely important, because when we talk about statistics and perception, public,
Yep.
all that stuff, getting an accurate beach count of how many people visited the beach. I mean, as a lifeguard, you know, whoa, it's way busier today than before, just by kind of your intuition.
Yep.
4th of July at Huntington, where I was taking photos, I mean, it looked like a Saturday at 7 in the morning.
Right.
And it's so hard to articulate, because that stuff for lifeguards articulates as well to, why are we funding an extra tower today? Why do you have 2 lifeguards in the tower today? Well, because we know that at 7 in the morning at Huntington City Beach, the parking lot is full.
Right.
But you have to articulate it based on data and science, which
Right.
lifeguards don't have time to do. We're busy in the ocean. So that is super cool.
Yeah.
And a huge way that is symbiotic
Right.
as well.
Right. And the thing is your point is the public really hasn't had good stats.
Correct.
To change that perceived risk to realized risk, right? So, and we would be a little hesitant to go, well, your chances of being bitten is 1 in 300 million or 1 in 3 million. We can't, and remember, that's several orders of magnitude off.
Yeah.
Right? Our ability to get good data to make those statistics has historically been limited. And lifeguards, you know what it's like, where you're trying to do a beach count. A beach count isn't realistic to the number of people in the water. Sometimes you go back to vehicles where you go, well, the parking lot's full. Let's assume there's 2 to 3 people per vehicle. We're going to translate that to a beach count. Or in water, you can't, right? So there's a bunch of people that go to the beach, never go in the water, or never go deeper than their ankles. So if you're putting guards on the beach and you want to know how many guards you're going to need for this weekend based on conditions, having those kinds of numbers of who's actually in the water, where are they in the water, I think really helps justify, we got to have 2 guards per tower. And they're going to be dealing with stingray injuries. They're going to be dealing with questions. Not to mention, somebody's going to be scanning just to make sure somebody's not getting in trouble. So I think these are the sorts of things that are byproducts of what we're trying to do. that really help guard cities, counties with staffing.
Is there anyone else that has this technology, or are you guys the ones that have worked and developed that, or is this a third party that's doing this AI counting of beach water stuff?
No, that was a bunch of science geeks getting together going, how can we make this more efficient? In Australia, they've been working on this technology for almost 2 decades. Okay. So they've really gone full force into using drones and using, image processing and AI to help, identify sharks along those beaches. That's their main goal, and it's used primarily as an early warning system. They'll actually pull people out of the water if sharks are sighted. Mm-hmm. We don't do that in California because mainly our goal is to use that information to educate lifeguards and educate the public so that they have a better idea of realized risk. People are making their own risk assessments. And I think that's interesting between Australia, South Africa, and California, or U.S., in that we've basically made it more, we put more onus on the public to make those risk assessments, right? And we haven't done, I think, a good enough job with education. In other places, they've been, let's say, more proactive. Like, for example, they have a couple bites at a beach. Instead of just putting out signs, they're now going out and culling sharks to try to reduce the probability. Studies have shown you have to cull a beach of sharks for decades before you'll reduce the numbers low enough to actually reduce bite rates.
And describe what culling is.
Culling is just going out and killing as many sharks as you can to lower the population to reduce that probability. And numerous scientific studies have shown that it just doesn't work. Like, you have to kill tens of thousands of sharks and other marine life to do that. So the question comes down to, is that worth it? Right? So obviously, one bite, one death, people look at those and they're horrible, right? But at the same time, the question is the cost, right? So many of those control programs in South Africa and Australia are very expensive. In addition, they have ecological impacts because they're killing whales, they're killing birds, they're killing turtles, they're killing all these other species that don't pose a risk to people. But at the same time, you're trying to convince people you're doing something to keep them safe.
Yeah, and talk to me. You kind of touched on it, but it was one of the questions I wanted to ask you, that ethical boundary of protecting the public, but now you're, let's say, with nets or with culling, and now you're changing the behavior of these species that have been around for how many years? Right?
Millions, yeah.
Millions of years in their home. And just in the last, you look at photos of the beaches from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. They're still using a line of rope to just barely go out into the ocean and come back. So the dynamic change of human interaction with the ocean environment has been, I would say, exponential without being a nerd or geek or knowing any of the numbers.
That's a safe relationship.
Paddleboarders, kayak, like everything. People are flying drones that are showing up, and they're seeing all this stuff now. But where is that ethical boundary in your eyes of protecting the public, putting giving them the power to choose whether it's safe or unsafe through education, through perception changes, PR makeover, as you called it, or affecting that shark's behavior because of these methods, like trying to deter them away? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so the science, I think, is pretty definitive on that. In other words, we know that you can go out and you can kill a lot of animals, and you're not gonna change the bite rate, not appreciably. You got to do it for decades, and you got to spend tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. And it's going to have ecological impacts. So people, in one hand, go, well, but we've saved potentially one person, potentially, right? But at the same time, all our whales are gone, all our turtles are gone, all our birds are gone. It's not the same ocean. So I think one of the things that I'm very proud about California for is their ecological ethos, right? So, we value the quality and the health of our ocean, even though we recreate in it. So, and people understand that, it's a wild place. The ocean is a wild place. And I think California has that ethos, but not all places have that ethos. In other words, the public doesn't share that same sense of feeling that this is a wild place. I call it the Disneyland effect, right? They go to a beach and they assume that their safety is guaranteed. And again, this is a misconception on the public, because that they go, well, that's what the lifeguards are here for. They're here to make sure I don't get hurt. And we have to remind them, no, they're there to help you if you get into trouble. But your decision on going in the ocean really comes down to what you know about that, right? And your ability to assess risk. In many ways, Americans are horrible risk assessors, right? Because of the Disneyland effect. So I think what's happening in some places, particularly California, is people are getting much better at doing their homework before they go to the beach and talking to lifeguards. And that's one of the things I think our lifeguards are great at. They're great ambassadors, right? So whether somebody's apprehensive, they know they can go up to a lifeguard and ask, hey, I'm not a good swimmer. Is it okay for me to swim here? And the guards will go, okay, this is a rip current. You want to stay away from there. Go down this into the beach. Or you should just know there's stingrays out there, there's sharks out there, there are things. Stay together, stay in a group. You do all those things, you'll be fine. So I think those are things that are changing. And in many places, that is not the case.
The way it was described to me really well when I was working lifeguarding, I think it was just one of the members of the public that was a local down in San Diego. He goes, what do you do when you go to, you and your family are going on a camping trip or a trip to the Sierras, right? And you're going to hike and camp for a while. What do you pack? You got your tent, you got your food, water, all this stuff. Why? You're going into the wilderness. Mm-hmm. You're going to bring some medical gear. You're going to bring extra whatever, all this stuff, right, to show up and go into the mountains. Well, when you park 10 feet from the sand and you walk out onto the beach, you are effectively going into this wilderness. Yep. But like you just said, the Disneyland effect, the perception is that it is like a public park. Mm-hmm. The grass is trimmed and they comb the sand and there's no, it's like, no. We're there because we know this environment is dangerous and the safety of the public needs to be handled there. But you are making the choice to go into this wild place with apex predators and things that can sting and bite you and ocean currents and all this stuff that's very dangerous. And I think that's a huge, and I love what I'll say it again, the PR makeover. The beach needs it.
Absolutely.
Right? And lifeguards need it, and that's why this conversation is happening as well. Let's touch on the number, just this week, riding along with the lifeguards. I've had that question probably 50 times. Hey, lifeguard, are there sharks out there? How would you like, as frontlines lifeguards, as being responsible for educating the public, let's say I'm a first-year lifeguard and I've got this question. What's the best way for me to approach this through a standpoint of education and disseminating good information out to the public?
Yeah, so that's been a big goal of ours. So one of the things we know is that in California, we have some of the best lifeguards in the world. They're the best trained.
Thank you.
It's true. I've been all over the world. I can definitely say that with great confidence. But the one thing that we have noticed is they're really good at water rescues. They know how to do that, but they're not marine scientists. And it's a different ocean than it was 20, 30, 50 years ago. A lot of these animals are coming back because conservation has worked, which means now you have big animals at a beach. You have dolphins, you have sea lions, you have seals, you have sharks.
Orcas now.
Oh, absolutely. You name it. And this is different. 50 years ago, that didn't happen because those animals were gone. And now they're coming back. And the problem is we have a public that isn't educated to understand that. Okay, so lifeguards are kind of ambassadors. People are going to come up and ask those kinds of questions. And what we're finding is lifeguards need that information. So we have developed an education program for lifeguards to provide them with who's out there and how do you identify them. And one of the things we found was if you're a lifeguard, your ability to identify some of those things is a perception sort of thing. If you're in the water, you can't see sharks. Like if you're swimming out, you can't see them. Visibility off our beaches is not great, right? And we've had situations where people have actually swam into sharks. The sharks were kind of resting and they bumped into them. So that's how bad visibility is. You can't even see the tail, right? But if you're on a rescue board or a rescue boat, you have a higher perception, right? So you can see down into the water. Now, what would you see and what would it look like? And can you tell the difference between a white shark, a seven-gill, a leopard shark? And now many of the districts have drones and they fly drones. And the aerial perception is completely different. So giving them these tools to identify these animals. And then the other part is behavior. So for example, many of the protocols we've helped lifeguards to develop about when you post a beach, when you close a beach, when you pull people out of the water is largely based on changes in behavior of sharks. White sharks are always out there. In fact, that's what we tell people. If you go in the water in Southern California, almost always you should assume that there's a white shark out there because that's what our data show. Does it mean that you're going to be bitten? No, absolutely not. But that doesn't mean they're not there. Okay, so then the next question is, if the sharks are acting in a way where they may be acting aggressively, okay, and the lifeguards need to take that information, be able to interpret that behavior, and then may go, you know what, we need to move things from level 1 to level 2. And level 2 is maybe we need to temporarily pull people out of the water, let things calm down. So that information becomes very important. And in our early days of developing that education program, we didn't know what what those behaviors look like. Now we do. So we can give that to guards, and then they can use that information, whether they're asking someone in the public to say, shark just came right up to me really fast and then darted away and came back again. And I got freaked out, so I came out of the water, and I just want to let you know. Okay, that is a sign of potential aggression. You might definitely want to pull people out of the water for a little while and let things settle down. So these are the sorts of things that even over the 6 or 7 years we've been doing this have already changed. And we're going to be working with Cal Chiefs to go through and revise those protocols because we're learning new things. So I think these are the sorts of things that the guards need to tell the public when they're walking down the beach. This is the ocean. Sharks should be in the ocean. Sharks are in the ocean. If you're going to go in the ocean, you should always assume sharks are out there. Not to scare them, actually inform them. A lot of our signage that we've developed for lifeguards to put at beaches gives them that information in a non-threatening, non-scary way, right? It just helps arm them with information. So lifeguards are ambassadors. We got to make sure they have all this information about stingrays, about sharks, things that can harm them. Let's talk about marine mammals. Right now, our marine mammal population's recovered better than anyone could imagine. But because of red tides, things like that, these animals can be sickened by those, and they'll come up on the beach where they normally wouldn't. So you've got a sea lion that hauls out, and people want to go down, and they either want to drag it back in the water to save it.
It's dehydrated.
Exactly.
Hell, so the poor, because they're so cute, and they want to just touch them. And
But that is a wolf.
Yes.
It is a wolf. It's
Thank
got
you.
canines bigger than a wolf.
Thank you.
Why would someone think that that's an appropriate thing to do? It is a wild animal, right? So educating guards to say, you got to keep people away. Immediately call the marine mammal rescue centers. That's what they're trained to do. Keep people away. They're going to want to put their kid next to them to take a selfie. That's nuts, right? So we've got to inform and educate the public so that they realize that's not a good thing. That's not a safe thing. We got to keep people away. Yeah, it's unfortunate about the animal. There's nothing they can do to rescue that animal, but they have to rely on people who are trained, just like lifeguards, to do their job. So I think those are the things that, as we better learn about these situations, and they're changing, right? So climate change is affecting this. It's going to increase the rate at which these things happen. We have to make sure the public and lifeguards are trained to deal with these challenges.
And a huge detail is what you just referred to, the change. And this is something where, in a simple sense, the next day the swell is 10 feet, whereas the day before it was 2, and you're with your family for that whole week. Hey, sorry, you can't swim today. Well, but we're here. Sorry, you can't swim today. If you go in the ocean today, the likelihood of you drowning is massive.
Right.
The ocean environment, not just over the tens and years of species coming back and that kind of thing, but day to day, the way the sand shifts, the way, like you said, the swell is smaller, the stingrays come in closer. This is the thing that's very difficult to articulate about our profession, and why one day you might be okay to have one lifeguard in a tower, or the next day you might need all hands on deck because of the way the storm of danger, right, comes into a perfect storm. So, man, it's so hard to express that, and it's so difficult, but that's why I think that ambassadorship, if you will, of lifeguards being on the front lines of explaining this stuff is so critical, because it changes day by day, but also we're on the front lines of that greater changing environment, and to articulate that.
Right.
So,
And see, I think that's the other great thing is our relationship with the lifeguards allows us to have this dialogue. So believe it or not, a lot of the questions they get help us understand the state of knowledge of the public. And we can use that to better tune our messaging and our education. So when lifeguards come to us and say, these are the typical questions the public's asking us, we're like, okay, then we've got a mission, right? Because we're clearly not hitting our mark in terms of messaging and education. So how are we going to fix that? How can we help you give them the right information. So I think what you just said is really important. How you deliver the information, how that information is provided. Is it backed up by science? These are the sorts of things that our collaboration with lifeguards has really helped. It's enabled us to move that needle faster.
I'm just getting a visual as we're talking here. Like there should be an iPad at every lifeguard tower that's like a Shark Lab iPad. Common questions about sharks, stingrays,
right.
that kind of stuff. And you just like click through it before you ask the lifeguard.
Right.
And get
yeah.
And then it's data collection because it's the front lines, but we're not, it's the lifeguarding field besides the PR makeover that I'm trying to do with the project. Right. But it's such a valuable, unstudied area. Right. Be it rip currents, be it the ocean, be it all this stuff. I mean, look how long you've been studying all these things as well. It's untapped in a way. And we're on that front line of the back and forth of it, delivering the information out through data, because there's a lot of folklore that exists. Like, well, back in my day, this is how this tower used to go off all the time or whatever. Right. And it's a back and forth. And I think it's so, there's a lot going through my head with that kind of stuff.
Well, and I think, that's something that is when you're in the field all the time, whether you're a biologist or you're a lifeguard, and you're seeing things day in, day out, and you can see that change. Like if you're a first-year lifeguard, you might not have had enough time on the water to see those changes. If you're a vet and you've been out there doing this for 20 years, you've seen some of those changes. So this is a challenge, right? So how do you communicate those sorts of things? The other thing is, if what we're telling lifeguards don't match what they're seeing, then that's a problem. In other words, if we're seeing things in our data and the lifeguards don't see that from their seat, we've got to figure out why. So is that a perception thing? Is that from the position at which they're viewing things, that they're not seeing what we're seeing in the data? And then the next thing that we really need to get to, and I think this is a good opportunity, is maybe we should have like a beach safety app. Everybody has a cell phone these days, right? So in addition to going up and asking a lifeguard, how about if lifeguards have a QR code saying, hey, check out this app, right? And it could be curated for every region, so it's easy to modify so that the species are all listed, the risks are all there. Some beaches, rip currents aren't an issue, right? Depending on where they are. Others, it's a huge issue, right? And it can change not only across days, within the day, right? So for the public to have that kind of information, I think that would really be powerful because everybody's got a cell phone now. Mm-hmm. So there's a good app development opportunity for somebody right there.
Well, and not just that, all the things you see are, and on Instagram and all this stuff, it's such a huge, go to this beach, untouched, or secret hidden gem of you name the area, right, on Instagram and all these tourism agencies and all that stuff. And none of them are speaking about the safety portion that comes with that. You don't just go tell someone to just, go to any random place without there being some level of, not that it has to be on this person or a hotel or that Instagram account, but there has to be a level of responsibility for people to be in tune with that. And there's very little that approaches those subjects on behalf of safety and education.
Yeah, I agree. And that's our starting point. Mm-hmm. Anytime, we're advising people about beach safety is, number one, do your homework. Know the beach you're going to. Know something about the conditions. Know about the animals you'll be sharing that beach with. Do they have guards? If they do, you automatically have somebody you can talk to about all those things. But before you put your feet in the water, you should do your homework. And that way you can have an enjoyable time and do it safely. Mm-hmm. That's step one. So, but most people, like you said, don't do that. They drive up 10 feet from the sand and they go, I'm at a beach. It's Disneyland. My safety is guaranteed. And that is not true. That's a misconception. So I think that's the first step in having a safe, enjoyable trip to the beach.
Yeah. Talk to me about when we hear shark attack. Mm-hmm. And you kind of broke it down for me a bit earlier, but it shouldn't be perceived as an attack. And we talk about bites and that all stuff. And when there is someone that actually their injuries do end up in a fatality, let's talk about that, the extreme of you're involved with a shark incident and it ends up in a fatality, and that whole perception and how we can approach that.
Yeah, and that's always been a challenge. In fact, this is probably the big unanswered question that has affected people's perception of sharks, right? So despite what you hear on television, Shark Week, whatever, we really don't know exactly why sharks bite people unprovoked. In other words, provoked are easy. If you go tug a shark's tail and it turns around and bites you, that's pretty explanatory, right? You were screwing with the shark, it's defending itself. But when you're out minding your own business and a shark bites a person, the question is why? So if it's defending itself, is that really an attack? So in those cases, we can't say that's an attack. So we generally refer to shark bites on people, especially the unprovoked ones, because we don't know the motivation. It could be predation related. In other words, the shark mistaked a person for a natural food item, and that's why it bit the person. Or it actually could be defending itself. So I'm a member of the International Shark Attack File. I'm the West Coast representative. We investigate shark bites on the West Coast. And it's really difficult to try to interpret what the motivation of the shark was based on information that we get from a victim or from witnesses, because we don't know what's going on in the shark's head minutes before it bites a person. So this is an unknown, and people hate unknowns, right? Unknowns are what make things scary. So what we try to get the public to understand is, by and large, remember, we're not on the menu, right? It's not a buffet out there. We know that for certain, but accidents do occur. So the question comes down to, is that accident the shark defending itself? And it's interesting, because if people look at it that way, they look at sharks differently. You know, everybody would defend themselves from attack, right? And in that case, it might look like a human attack on a shark, and the shark's just defending itself. So when you flip the script on that, people look at sharks differently. Food related, that gets a little tricky, right? But everybody makes mistakes, and the public can relate to that, right? It's just sharks are really well tuned for their environment, and those mistakes, they don't make very often. So, and this is something really cool. We're doing some research on this now, how sharks perceive people. So I have a grad student who's going out, and what we notice from our drone video is that sharks will orient to a swimmer or a surfer from a distance of about 60 feet away. Now, the both are at the surface. There's no way the shark can see the person at the surface, but it orients to them. And sometimes they're up current of the person, which means they can't detect an odor. So we think that it's sound or vibration, which travels really well through the water. Sharks have ears inside their head. They can detect low-frequency sounds. They can feel vibrations along these sensors along the outside of their body. So this grad student, what we're doing is we're going out and we have students swim back and forth between buoys. And she's recording the sounds that a swimmer makes and the vibrations that they produce while they're swimming at different speeds. Then we have the same person, we put them on a surfboard, we had them paddle the surfboard back and forth between the buoys. Then they get in a kayak and they paddle a kayak. Now the kayak's interesting because we've seen an increase in bites on kayaks. And one of the reasons for that is we think the kayak acts like a drum. So in other words, that sound is reverberating off the hull and it echoes better. So what she's doing is she's recorded these sounds and the vibrations that these different water users make, and they're different. So what if these sharks that are around these people every single day at a beach are going, well, it's not food and it's not chasing me, so it's not a threat. And I'm beginning to recognize that that's a swimmer, that's a surfer, that's a paddler, and then they ignore people. Okay, so her experiment is now she's going to take this list of sounds that she's characterized. She's going to make a playlist, and then we have this cool underwater speaker, and we're going to go play it back to sharks and ask, what can you hear, and can you differentiate? Now, our hypothesis is they won't respond. Why? Because they've habituated to these sounds at these beaches. So you ask somebody who lives near a freeway, hey, you hear the freeway noise? They'll be like, what freeway noise? But you bring somebody who lives in the woods, and they're like, oh my God, it's deafening, right? So we actually think some of these sharks are learning by interacting with people on a daily basis to ignore us. We're flotsam at a beach. We're just floating debris.
Wow, that's super interesting. For a second, I thought you were going to say you were making the grad student go between buoys with sharks around.
Well, we do that.
I was gonna
You know why? Because there's always sharks in the water.
Yeah, no, of course.
Yeah.
And then also, just kudos to, I can only imagine what your grad students are doing between snorkeling with carpets of stingrays and white sharks and everything. But
Yeah. So the
super
rule in the
cool.
lab is don't tell your mom you're doing
Okay,
this,
yeah.
right? Yeah, exactly. They all know the risks, and many of them, know from doing all our safety training. And we train just like you guys do, safety, 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 safety. So we have trauma kits that we're trained to use. They go out in the boats with us. We're diving in these waters all the time. Visibility is zero. My team has done this for years. We never see a shark underwater. So we know they're there. We can see them from the drone. The drone's right above us. When my team of divers goes by, shark swims right by the divers. Divers, we were like, "Do you see that shark? It was 8 feet." Didn't see a thing. So we do this all the time. This is why we feel comfortable and safe doing this. And again, we're minding our own business. We're not out chasing the sharks. We're there to download receivers, do our mission. Nonetheless, we need to prepare for if something does occur. So all my students are wilderness first aid trained. We have a major trauma kit that we always carry in the boat. They know what to do if something should happen.
Yeah, and seeing the photos, I think I brought up to you earlier on that subject, from the 70s of the CSU Shark Lab, and you can look on the website there, and there's all these scruffy guys, researchers with mustaches and all stuff. I'm like, you guys are basically lifeguards, because it's a similar approach. But also how cool that you're in this all the time, surrounded by this subject, and you have this valuable decades of experience, and here it is from you telling us that it's really not that big of a deal, and with the perception that's been coming out with the public. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation, and I think it's important for lifeguards, it's important for the public to understand that it's different than just danger, fear, and attack, all this evil stuff that's going on with sharks.
Yeah, and again, this is kind of one of those interesting things about our relationship between science and the lifeguards, is that, when these aggregations, you get these juvenile white sharks that are hanging out at these beaches, and our tagging data shows and our drone data shows they're there every single day in, day out, for weeks to months. And then there are lifeguards that have to monitor those beaches. They have to do swims. They've got junior lifeguard programs. And in the early days, they were like, we don't think it's safe. So, but then they see us in the water, diving on our receivers every day. And then they start going, okay, these guys are doing it. They seem to, based on the data that they're getting, they seem to be comfortable doing that. So then the lifeguards feel more comfortable doing that. And I think that's been a really important thing. We can't just say, do this, without us actually being willing to do it ourselves. And I think that has built confidence. That has shown that this is the data that we're getting. Based on these data, we think the probability of being bitten is very low. And that makes the lifeguards feel more comfortable doing what they need to do. So the question is then, does the public see that and go, well, the lifeguards seem comfortable getting out there and they know the sharks are there. Okay, then I can trust them. And I think that's been an important part of this evolution, right? Because in the early days, if you'd have asked me, is it safe for us to swim out there around 8-foot white sharks? I'd be like, I don't know about that. But the data is showing me something different.
Yeah. As I've got a couple more questions as we slowly wrap it up, but in the presence of, let's say there is an actual bite encounter, someone's injured in the water. We've talked about the reasons why a shark might do that. It happens. In those environments, you've been studying the bites, there's a unspoken, like in the lifeguard units, right? Like, hey, we're sitting there for a couple hours. What would you do if there's a shark bite today? Would you swim out, kind of thing? Based on the patterns that you've seen or the situations where these bites had occurred, not that you're going to say like, oh yeah, you should or shouldn't swim out. That's a thing for the safety of the rescuer to make in the moment, a judgment call. But how, if a shark is in that sense, and I don't even want to call it aggressive, but if it did bite something for whatever reason, how likely is it that it's going to come back and do that again? If I'm swimming out to rescue someone on a paddleboard, or if I'm swimming out with limited data and all that, like preemptively prepped with everything we've talked about, what's your perception in that moment for lifeguards swimming out for someone who's been potentially bitten to try to save their life?
That's a great question. And it's something we are starting to look at in more detail. So as records build, what I can tell you is that there are differences among species, and there are differences in terms of the number of sharks present. So one of the things that we've noticed is, for example, with these white shark bites in California, shark bites, the person is bleeding profusely, rescuers are able to come help them, they never see the shark again. It's rare for that to happen, which means I feel more comfortable telling lifeguards that with white sharks at least, and there's only one shark present, your chances of a first responder being injured is very, very low based on that behavior. In other places, for example, like let's say in the Gulf or off Florida, bull sharks are a different game, right? So one of the things we've seen with bull sharks is even a single bull shark may be more likely to lash out at a first responder. So in different places, because of different species and their behaviors, people are gonna have to think about those things. The other thing that we've learned is that if there's more than one shark present, sometimes the game changes. It's almost like a mob mentality where we're more likely to see flesh removed from a person if there is competition. So if a shark bites a person, there's another shark in the area, you're more likely to have greater injury, flesh removed, or a first responder bitten. So making those assessments are really important, right? How many sharks are involved? What species is involved? And sometimes you don't have that information. So you're absolutely right. They're the ones that have to make that decision at the spur of the moment. But in California, what we've seen, based on the records, especially with white sharks, first responders could safely get in the water, even with blood in the water, and get somebody out and feel pretty comfortable doing that based on the statistics that we have so far.
Yeah, and all liability and all that stuff off of you as far as a recommendation, but I just wanted your
absolutely
opinion on that.
Yep.
And obviously every situation is different. We're not
Yep.
telling
Nope.
lifeguards
Absolutely
that they
not.
should. Everyone's making their own assessment,
Right.
but this is what we talk about
Right.
in the lifeguard units.
Yeah.
Like, hey, what if
Yep.
every day? And
Yep.
this is a hot topic one of like, would
Yep.
you go out or not?
Yep.
So thank you for that.
And again, I'm not going to give them any advice that I wouldn't give my students.
Sure.
Right? Or I wouldn't do myself, because I have people in the water too.
Yeah, and you guys are, yeah.
Absolutely. And again, it's based on the data that we have now. And it's not a lot, but it is something. So, these are the sorts of things that are going to change over time.
Mm-hmm.
The ocean's changing, so behavior is going to change too.
Absolutely.
And that means I might be right today, but I could be wrong tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Chris, the one thing I want to kind of end this with is, what an incredible conversation. This is so valuable that it seems so simple, but if you're not in that environment, like the public and everything, it's hard to access that information easily and really change your mind about this subject. But your lab right now, and I'll let you speak on it, is at a point where your funding is reaching a limit. Can you speak on that and how people can help? Because I think everything we just talked about, I'm getting like 20 different ideas of where this can go in the future, right, as far as impacts that this can make, positivity, not just lifeguarding, public safety, research, all of the above. And for me to hear that your lab is potentially not going to have funding is not only alarming, but just doesn't make sense because this seems so valuable. So talk to me about where you guys stand with that and how can we or anybody help?
Sure. So we were funded by the state in 2018, $3.75 million, primarily to do research. But we quickly learned if you do research without education outreach, what's the point, right? So this has a big multi-pronged approach. In addition, we do social science, we do economics, because all of those things factor in. And it's really all about public safety. Unfortunately, we were lined up to get more state funding, but the state budget went bad. And right now it doesn't look like it's going to come back for a year or two. So our state funding ends in September. It doesn't look like we're going to be refunded by the state because of the state budget. It's not that they don't view the program as being important, but they have bigger fish to fry, right? So in the meantime, we need money to stay alive. So in the absence of that, we're going to try to hit up some of the counties, some of the cities, even private funds can help keep us afloat. It costs me about $900,000 a year to run the program. I have 12 staff. We cover the entire state, which is a big state. We use a lot of expensive technology, but it's cutting edge. And it gives us information, and our lifeguards information you couldn't get anywhere else. And we're developing new experiments like the hearing one to really help everybody understand how sharks perceive people. So in the absence of money, you just can't do that work. So there's our monitoring, which we do all the time. We have 240 white sharks swimming around with tags right now that give us that monitoring data. If we lose our funding in September and we have no more money, I have to pull all the equipment out of the water, which means the lifeguards get no more reports, right? So that information is really helpful in helping them reduce beach closures. Every time you close a beach, it's an economic cost to that community. The other thing is that worries me the most is we have several big events coming up in Southern California. World Cup's going to be here in 2 summers. The Summer Olympics is going to be here in 4 summers. We're bringing millions of people to Southern California, and they're not going to come here in the summer and not use our beaches. So we've got to make sure the lifeguards have all the information they need to keep those people safe. So we have all those tools. And if we shut things down and we have to gear it up, it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that. So we just need money to stay alive, and I think we'll get back into the state budget.
Yeah, super important. I mean, and you allude to good things, which is the state of California is not the state like the government, but the physical state, the environment that people come to from all over the world. The reason they're coming is to recreate in the ocean. One major reason, right? Tourism, hotels, all that stuff. Not just for the impact it makes on lifeguards, but for all that. The research,
Yeah.
the knowledge that the public is going to want to know. Right? And so if we can make money off of that in large sums, there has to be someone out there that can, one, not just help your lab and keep that funding going, but help the lifeguards take that burden on to keep people more safe. And both things are relating to the safety of the people that are coming to spend the money and to be visitors to California. And so there has to be some way to improve both subjects on behalf of the bigger goal of what everyone's doing.
And you know the stats, right? Ocean recreation is $1 billion industry in California alone. $1 billion, right? Think of that state revenue that comes in. And that's why we originally got the funding from the state, because they recognize that value. Now, when times get tough, obviously you got to tighten the belt. But you know, there are certainly people out there, there are other agencies that have the money that could just keep us afloat. Even private donors. Shoot, there are people that are avid surfers who $7 million is nothing. That would keep us going for 5 years and help us grow. So, I mean, these are the sorts of things that we need right now just to keep things alive. And it will have huge benefits for the state of California.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Chris, unless there's any other closing remarks, things you want to leave people with that, you know, you kind of want to close it out with, I mean, that's everything that I had. I think that's a very valuable conversation.
Mainly, I just have to thank the lifeguards. They have been amazing partners. We've learned a lot from them. Hopefully, they've learned something from us. And we definitely need to keep this partnership going because we can't do what we do without you. And hopefully, we're providing you with things that will really help you do your job, make it easier.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I hope this is the catalyst for keeping that relationship not only moving forward, but expanding it and everything that you guys are doing. So thank you, Chris.
Thanks. Appreciate it.